Hello everyone, welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfray, I'm the director. Before introducing the speaker this afternoon, I'll just explain what we're going to do. Liam is going to give a talk for 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to go to a panel discussion for a bit, and then we'll have questions from the floor. And on the panel, I'll introduce them now. We're joined by Barbara Petrongolo. Barbara is Professor of Economics and a Professorial Fellow at Nuffield College here in Oxford. She's Director of the Centre for Economic Policy Research Labour Economics Programme, and she's an expert in labour markets, the effects of job search frictions, gender inequalities, and many other factors that affect the labour market. And with Barbara will be Brian Nolan, who's Professor of Social Policy here at Oxford in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. Brian's an expert on income inequality, poverty, intergenerational wealth transfer, and economics of social policy. And I'm very pleased that Brian was the director of an Oxford Martin School programme on inequality and prosperity. So let me introduce properly our speaker, the Right Honourable Liam Byrne. Liam is MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill and has had a distinguished career as a parliamentarian. He was a minister in Gordon Brown's, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's administration as Cabinet Office Minister and Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Today he chairs the influential Business and Trade Committee. His background, he read politics and history at the University of Manchester, has been a Fulbright scholar at Harvard, and has had a fellowship at Nuffield College here as well. Liam has written a number of books, and the most recent, which was published a couple of weeks back by Bloomsbury, is on the inequality of wealth, why it matters and how to fix it. And Liam's going to be giving us some of the insights that he's gained while writing the book. Thank you, Liam.
Yeah, thank you. Just thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be back here at the Oxford Martin School, not just to talk about a wonderful new book available in all good bookshops, but also to say a huge thank you to many of the people to whom I owe intellectual debts. Many of them are here tonight. So I am sure that those debts are only going to increase over the course of this evening. So I'm not going to talk for very long. Westminster is full of politicians who talk for much too long. I've got friends I haven't spoken to for days because I didn't want to interrupt them. So I'm just going to talk for about 15 minutes, which is, as we say in Westminster, is the average lifespan of a Tory Chancellor. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts about the book, why we put it together, and a bit of the journey that I took to write the book. And of course, it's a book that draws on an immense amount of the work and research that has been undertaken here for some time at Oxford. But of course, we've been writing books about wealth in this country for a long time. In fact, we've been writing books about wealth since this chap, back in the 1770s. But despite that long history of erudition, despite that long history of economics, despite that long history of books about wealth, if we stopped people out on the street here today and asked them what was the wealth of the country, I'm not sure how many people could actually tell us. Now, when I was born in the holy town of Warrington back in 1970, this is my earliest childhood photo. As you can see, I was all set to play for Liverpool, 13 miles from where I was born, to my beautiful parents, who were sort of children of the 60s radicals, met during the anti-apartheid movement, I think charging onto rugby pitches actually to stop the Springboks playing in English rugby stadia. But since I was born, the wealth of this country has actually multiplied by 100-fold. Now, I don't think those two things are related, but I mean, nonetheless, what is really striking about this graph is the way the wealth of our country has multiplied quite as fast as it has. And of course, you will have spotted immediately that this moment that we had a few years ago, the financial crash, actually interrupted maybe briefly the accumulation of wealth in our country. But since then, the growth in our household wealth in this country has pretty much doubled. So we now have a 100-fold increase in the wealth of our country since I was born to about £12 trillion. Now, even that is a hard number to get your head around. It's one of those sort of telephone numbers in British politics. But if you take that standard unit of British measurement, the distance between John O'Groats and Land's End, you could basically pave a path of gold about 5.5 billion bars wide from John O'Groats to Land's End. That's how much £12.2 trillion is. But here's the inconvenient truth. For much of my time on this planet, for much of my time growing up with my two lovely parents, the way that we shared our wealth was getting fairer. Wealth inequality was actually going down. But of course, since 2010, something began to change. In fact, this is World Inequality data, database data. But if you look at what has happened to the top 1% versus everybody else, the wealth of the top 1% has grown by about 31 times as much as everybody else. That's an extraordinary change in the nature of our economy. And one of the books that I came across that I loved in writing The Inequality of Wealth was by Walter Schneidel. It's quite a depressing book, Walter's book. It basically says that, look, the only way to really end serious inequality is through war or a revolution. Those are basically your two options. But he's got this great figure in there about how 2,000 years ago, the wealth of the richest Romans was about 1.5 million times the empire's average income. Well, if you look at the fortunes of the Hinduja family today, their wealth is about 1.3 million times the average income of somebody here in our country. So at its extremes, right, as at extremes, that is how wealth inequality is now changing our country. And one of the groups that I chair in Parliament, the All-Party Group on Inclusive Growth, we've been looking, I'll share some links to this, but we did some polling last year, looking at how that is changing how people feel about our country. And you know, this impact is now so significant that people now believe that the top 1% have more power than national governments. So if you think about all of that kind of cultural stuff that you see, whether it is, I don't know what you watch, Above Deck, Below Deck, Succession, The Gilded Age, you name it, this kind of burgeoning kind of category of content, which some call wealth porn. It's not an accident. It's because our inner anxiety dreams are telling us something, which is that we are deeply, profoundly worried about the level of wealth inequality in our country today. And that inequality is why we now have this moral emergency of, on the one hand, sales of super yachts and private jets and luxury cars at an all-time high, while the reality in constituencies like mine in Hodge Hill is food bank use, which is going up and up and up and up. These House of Commons library figures, they just, that's the last number from Trussell Trust. But in Birmingham, in the last year alone, the number of food parcels issued went up by 40%. 40% in 1 year on top of that long history. And so I don't need to go on a poverty safari because I serve the most income-deprived constituency in the country. So the stories that I tell about working with the homeless community, working with the hungry in Birmingham, that's my day job. The bit, I suppose, that was new, that needed a bit of research, was wandering off to see how the other half live. And so for those who are interested, there's lots in the book about how we build super yachts, how we build luxury cars. I don't know what kind of car you drive, but if you have the money, you can now buy a Rolls Royce with a roof that is the constellation of the stars on the night that you propose to your loved one. You can sit on the hides of cows which live at the highest mountains in the world because mosquitoes aren't there, so they can't make ugly pockmarks on the leather. You can get a paint job that is the colour of an Amazonian tree frog. You could get a paint job that matches your Rolls Royces to your private jets. It is, if you like, the absurdity of affluence. But the thing that I see the thing that worries me most as a politician is not the absurdity of affluence. It's not the conspicuous consumption. It's the inconspicuous consumption, not of stuff, but of power. And what I see now in the corridors of Westminster is big money washing through the corridors like I've never seen before. And if you like, that's the point about political economy in the book. When you have significant inequalities of wealth, inevitably that will begin to infect the equality of power. And that's what we've got. And that's why, if you look around the world, you tend to see three things. When you see countries that are very unequal, they become poor because people with money avoid paying their taxes. When you think about the Pandora Papers or the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers, they're all basically telling you one thing, which is that those who have got lots tend to try and avoid paying a load of tax on it. Second, they become quite corrupt. I don't want to sort of labour this point. I'll maybe just leave you with three letters, PPE, and I don't mean the stuff that's taught down the road. And of course, they become stagnant countries. Social mobility begins to collapse. And you can see this in a very pronounced way in America, but you're beginning to see it here in our country too. So the heirs of somebody born poor, it will now take them 5 generations to rise up and earn even average wages. So even if you don't care about the injustice of wealth inequality, even if you are quite instrumentalist about things, presumably you should care about these things. And so this year is the 10th anniversary of Piketty's great book on capital. And for those of you who know Piketty, you may know the challenge that was given to him by his mentor, Tony Atkinson, which is, okay, but what are you going to do about it? And so the little book on polling begins to set out lots and lots about what the British public thinks are some of the solutions. And what we've tried to do in our polling is we've tried to find, I guess, what John Rawls called the overlapping consensus between left and right, between the generations, between the Brexiteers and the Remainers about what it is going to take to fix inequality. And the surprising thing is there's a remarkable amount of consensus between generations, between left and right, between Brexit and Remainers. But I wanted to take aim at the inequality of wealth because I've become convinced now that that's what's driving so many other problems. Now, I'm slightly intimidated here tonight because someone in the audience is the James Mead Professor of Economics. But nonetheless, the back, who's going to correct me if I get this wrong, but the back third of the book then is a book about solutions. Because if you're in politics, you're in the solutions business. We can't simply have more and more of what Jeremy Hayward once describes as elegant descriptions of the problems. We actually need some solutions. Not just solutions that people are going to like on social media, but solutions that people are actually going to vote for in a general election. And so the ideas that are presented here aren't novel. They're not dangerous. They may be radical, but they're all ideas that have been found to work somewhere rather well. And what James Mead told us back in the 60s is that if you care about wealth inequality, you've basically got to worry about these. You've got to worry about these things. You've got to worry about earned income, which I guess you would say comes from wages, but also comes from growth. You've got to worry about the savings rate. You've got to worry about the returns on those savings, and of course, you've got to worry about tax. And so, where the book goes is to say, well, look, okay, let's take that. Let's think about growth, not just somewhere, but everywhere. Let's think about how we act to raise earnings. Let's think about universal basic capital. Let's think about sovereign wealth funds. Let's think about restoring fairness to the tax system. And of course, as you can tell, as a politician, I'm addicted to 5-point plans like everybody else who works in Westminster. But that's the basic structure of the book. And it starts with this point about earnings, because as you'll know, and I won't have to labour this point in this audience, the growth of our country has been very poor for a long, long time now. GDP per capita has been even worse. But if we're serious about giving the country a pay rise, then we've got to find ways of fostering a bigger supply, a faster supply of knowledge-intensive jobs. Knowledge-intensive jobs pay 1/3 more than the average job. The problem is that most of them right now are concentrated in London and the Southeast. So on the Business and Trade Committee, we start tomorrow our big inquiry on industrial policy. But the basic message is we've got to start building creative states, not just a state, but radical devolution of economic power, so that every part of the country has the freedom to build institutions that mobilise people, capital, and money. Second, we have to think about how we raise the share of earnings in our national income. As you can see, from the 50s, basically, the flow of national income going to labour has fallen pretty dramatically. And And that is in part because we permit a kind of capitalism that tolerates, allows, encourages, incentivizes a race to the bottom. But here's the thing. Many of those companies are financed by us. They're financed by £2 trillion worth of pension savings. But if you're a pension saver right now, there's no way that you can know whether what you're investing in is a company that is screwing their workers or dodging their taxes or poisoning the planet. And so rolling up the 32,000 different pension funds into a handful of super funds, creating real transparency so that you've got choices about where you invest, making sure we've got boardrooms that take a longer view about investment decisions by, putting workers on boards. There's a way of creating a civic capitalism that empowers you as pension savers to drive our economy in a different direction, and I would hope begin to drive that money up. Third, if you raise the rate of earnings, if you raise the rate of growth in earnings, there's then a question about savings. So the average, we have about a quarter of people in our country with average savings of less than £100. But one of the big problems, that is a problem in itself, but there's a big problem in the structure of our economy now because, back when I was holding that little football, the wealth of our country was only about 3 times national earnings. Now it's 10 times national earnings. What that means is that assets are much more expensive compared to what you earn. So if you don't own assets today, like a house or like an education or like a pension, you're basically screwed. So rather than take an approach of universal basic income, I propose something called universal basic capital. It's a way of creating proper tax incentivized accounts based on a rollout of something that the National Endowment for Savings Trust is doing called sidecar accounts. You give everybody a universal savings account, and then you begin to look quite forensically at how you rebalance what Titmuss called fiscal welfare. So if you look, sorry, the graph hasn't 100% come out here, but there's about 60 to 70 billion pounds worth of tax subsidies that go to people who've already got assets. It's what James Mead called the principle of to those who have shall be given. It's not done in a very progressive way. We could be thinking about how we restructure those tax incentives in a way that actually rewarded not just some who have things, but those who don't have things. And one of the most important things we could do is take an idea from the Intergenerational Commission on Fairness and look at how you would give a £10,000 tax break or savings match to everybody at the age of 25 so that they could begin to get a foot on the housing ladder. Wouldn't solve everybody's problem, but £10,000 is the average shortfall on a deposit, and it would be far easier to generate that one-off dividend for young people if we had something called a sovereign wealth fund. Now, sadly, we didn't put the oil earnings into a sovereign wealth fund back in the 1980s, like the Norwegians. If we'd done that, we would have a sovereign wealth fund of about £500 billion. Anyway, let's learn the mistake from the mistake of the past, and let's think about how you would do that today. It's not novel, it's not radical, it's something that 80 countries around the world are doing, and crucially, it democratizes access to the best returns because sovereign wealth funds generate a return of about 8% a year. If you use that kind of wealth to generate that one-off dividend to young people to help them get started in life, you would basically create a mechanism for an intergenerational transfer of wealth that we don't have today. Now, you can build these funds in lots of different ways. But the truth is, it would be an awful lot faster to build these funds if we restored fairness to the tax system. Now, I don't know, how many people here have read Rishi Sunak's tax return? No? Okay, 2, okay. Well, for the rest of you, it's lucky I've done it for you. So Rishi Sunak earns a couple of million a year. Anyone want to guess the rate of tax he pays? 23%. 23%. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because 1 in 5 people are paying 40% tax. And it's a problem because look at how our economy has changed. So these grey bars, that is the wealth of the country. So it's up to, getting on for 12 and a bit trillion. The green line is investment income. The best estimates the House of Commons Library could come up with. It's doubled, right? It's doubled this century to about £80 billion. Problem is, nearly 60% of it goes to the top 10% of people in our country, the richest 10%. So think about what we've just done as a country over the last 13 years. We've just put £850 billion worth of quantitative easing into the monetary system. That's knocked maybe 1% off interest rates. If you own assets like a house, wealth has gone up. People like Rishi Sunak made big capital gains. And now you're paying half the rate of tax of everybody else. So the case the book makes is, well, look, isn't there an argument now for restoring fairness to the tax system? Isn't there a case for making sure that we have a tax code that reflects our moral code? This is the final point I wanted to make, which is the point of optimism, because when I've got 3 kids at university, and when I showed them the draft of the book, they got a bit depressed, and so I realised I had to kind of just end on an air of optimism. And I am an optimist because of places like Oxford. 90% of scientists who have ever lived are alive today. The things that will be invented, whether it is AI or genetic medicine or global gigabit connectivity or the transfer to green energy, will transform the lives and livelihoods of the world. We will add, I don't know, 100 trillion pounds to world wealth by 2060. That could unlock options, agency, opportunities for people in a completely new way. It could give people new freedoms to be you, freedoms to live the way that you want to live. It could give you freedoms like the rights up here. But if we want freedom, we've got to recognise, as Franklin Roosevelt recognised, that there is no freedom without security, and there is no security without wealth. And that, ultimately, is why, however we do it, we've got to have a debate and an argument as a country about how we rebuild that old ideal of a wealth-owning democracy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Liam, for that tour de force. Barbara, would you like to respond to some of the issues Liam brought up?
Thanks. I really enjoy listening to Liam's presentation and I learn lots, so thank you very much. I'd like to add a couple of points from... Oh, sorry. I forgot the microphone, sorry.
Thank you.
I'd like to add a couple of points from an economist, a labor economist perspective. So, well, let me just start from the sort of middle ground to say, while some degree of inequality in incomes and wealth might be sort of justified, then of course we might be worried about some of its consequences. So the key issue is, when is inequality too much inequality? And I think that already in your talk, you have highlighted some of the consequences. So for example, there is something about political representation or policy design. And of course, you've made the example about taxation, that you may run into this kind of paradox in which the very rich pay a lower share of tax than the median voter, simply because capital is taxed at a lower rate than labor. So these points highlight key issues of social justice. And I'd like to add that when one thinks about inequality and inequality of opportunities, there's also a discussion about allocative efficiency. So one can think, for example, that the allocation of talent is not efficient, is not optimal, whenever inequality prevents access of some groups to education or to labor market opportunities. So the requirement for allocative efficiency is that talent can be matched to the education tracks or to the careers that maximizes the return. Now, if inequality, because, for example, of financial constraints or social constraints, inhibits this kind of match between innate talent and whatever you're best at, it means that talent is not allocated in the most sort of efficient way, in the most productive way. So basically, in this case, equalizing opportunities is not just a matter of redistribution from one group to another group. It also has the potential to increase the sort of size of the total pie. And in a sense, one can sort of abandon this kind of zero-sum fallacy and think that some sort of lifting of barriers can improve allocative efficiency. Now, these are not just abstract ideas. There are some examples from the recent economic literature that really speak about this kind of allocative efficiency. So, for example, against the backdrop of rising inequalities over the past half-century and even before, there are two dimensions of inequality that actually have shrunk. For example, the gaps between the economic fortunes of men and women and the economic fortunes of whites and ethnic minorities in most high-income countries. And this has happened via declining discrimination, of course, and also widening participation to education. Now, it has been estimated that in the US, about a quarter of the increase in GDP per head over the past 50 years could be explained by the fact that groups that were sort of marginalized from certain careers had better sort of paths of entry into those barriers. So this is really a case in which declining barriers has improved the allocation of resources, the allocation of talent, and fostered economic growth. So this, of course, can benefit everybody. Then another very interesting example from a recent paper on inventors, I thought it was super interesting because it finds that in the US, people who become inventors and generate patents and new knowledge, etc., they predominantly come from the very high echelon of the distribution. So if you compare children of people in the top 1% to children in the bottom half of the distribution, so there is a factor of about 10 times about the likelihood of becoming an inventor. And this kind of gap persists even among children who have very similar test scores in maths, if you want to think of something that might be predictive of inventors. So it means that the barrier to access in this profession means that there's lots of missing inventors out there and a lot of lost inventions that could have improved the conditions and the lives of everybody. And then if I may add one last point about policy, of course you mentioned several policies and taxation was one of the most interesting, I thought. Another point also refers to market structure. So again, it's sort of purely economist sort of perspective. So if one looks at some of the primitive factors that induce this big increase in earnings inequality, I mean, these are like global forces. For example, technological progress or international trade has become so much more globalized. But then these primitive forces were only like one part of the ensuing inequality. The rest happen through, let's say, firms' dynamics. So the interaction across different firms and the way in which, for example, technological progress or globalization has pushed some of the productivity gains and cost gains towards larger firms, most productive firms, so that precisely due to competition, some industries became more concentrated. So they became increasingly dominated by like superstar firms. So you would see the rise of monopolies or monopsony. So in these cases, if an employer has monopsony power, market power over their employees, they can pay wages below the marginal product of labor, below productivity. So this is something that could be behind the fall in the labor share. So it's higher inequality between labor and capital. So this highlights really the importance about competition policy. Okay, I will stop here, sorry. Maybe I've taken
Thank you, Barbara. Liam, do you want to respond to that? Because there were a number of points there.
Why don't we hear from Brian, and then I can.
Sure, thank you. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from reading this book, and the challenge in responding to it is that there's so much in it that it would be absolutely ridiculous to try and even cover the five strategic points that Liam set out, much less the wealth of development of them that's in the book. So let me just focus in on a very specific aspect of it, and that's to do with what we do about it in terms of taxation. So I think what Liam brought out in the presentation, which is very important, is that the most salient thing that we have to get our heads around is how much wealth has been increasing relative to income. We're actually not really sure what's happened to the distribution of wealth. And as so often, the extent to which wealth inequality is seen to have increased depends on who you ask and whose numbers you look at. In particular, whether you look at, for example, Thomas Piketty's numbers versus the Office for National Statistics. But there is no dispute that what Piketty emphasized in his big book, the extent to which wealth to income ratios have increased, and consequently the extent to which wealth matters even more now, wealth and its distribution matter even more now than they did 20 or 30 years ago. That's absolutely, we should have that in the forefront of our minds, I think. So what are we going to do about it? Well, as Liam again put it, some of the long-term historical literature is rather depressing about this, emphasizing the role of wars and recessions as dampening down wealth inequality, and that it's rather hard to do otherwise. But of course, the one thing that we think did really have an impact in holding down wealth inequality for a significant period after the Second World War was highly progressive taxation of income and of wealth. Now, this obviously runs into points that Barbara's been adverting to as to what impact these are going to have, but it's certainly the case that highly progressive taxation, and I mean highly, did have a measurable impact at a time when, of course, there was also significant growth. Now, it's interesting to reflect back on what happened in the 1980s and 90s, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of the underlying interpretation of the economics of income and wealth taxation. In the 1980s, an influential strand of economics was seen as supporting the notion that income from capital should be taxed at a lower rate than income from earnings, and indeed that some aspects of optimal tax theory were interpreted as implying that you should be taxing income but not wealth, or at least if you taxed income properly, you wouldn't have to tax wealth. So I guess now things have moved on a lot in terms of both the underlying economics and in terms of the policy agenda. And we're now focused on ways to raise revenue that don't involve loading more taxes on earned income. And wealth comes to the fore as a not least as a possible source of revenue there. There are lots of other arguments for wealth taxes, including the normative arguments that Liam emphasised. We can come to them in the discussion if you like. But what would a wealth tax look like, and how would we get people to vote for it? There are colleagues here who know much more about the politics than I do, but I just want to make one pretty central point, and it goes back to a quote from an American politician that a friend and colleague of mine who was on various tax commissions would always quote. So Wilbur Mills, back in the 60s, I think, was an important American politician who used to say, don't tax me, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. So what you get in reaction to proposals about taxing wealth depends very much on how you frame it and who it looks like will be hit, and how high up the wealth distribution you put the threshold, and where the person responding thinks they are on that wealth hierarchy themselves. So let me just illustrate the range of options that are out there in the public debate, and I think quite damagingly tend to be conflated in the way these issues get debated. So I'll just throw these at you, and then we go back to the discussion. So the president of the Paris Club suggested at Davos a wealth tax of 2% annually for multimillionaires. What's a multimillionaire? I suppose they have more than two, maybe, rising to 5% for billionaires. So that's billionaires. Piketty proposed tax rates of 90% on wealth of more than 2 billion. I'm not even going to bother telling you the currencies here. The EU Tax Observatory by his colleague Gabriel Zuckman, which does really valuable and important work, talked about a 2% EU-wide wealth tax on the bloc's 499 billionaires. We're told by Oxfam that there are, well, they're relying on Credit Suisse, or it used to be Credit Suisse, that there are 2,460 billionaires worldwide, and Oxfam talk about a global tax of 2% on the world's millionaires and 5% on the billionaires. And just note in passing there that to be in the global top 1%, you would have to have $1 million in net wealth. It's not that much if you've got a house that you've paid off your mortgage on and you're in a particular part of this country. Ed Wolfe, who's done the best work on the US in this topic, and I'll stop with this, he compares as the sort of wealth tax that Switzerland actually has, which taxes wealth at a very low rate from a very low figure, compared with the tax that Elizabeth Warren was proposing around the time of the last election, where they raise similar amounts of revenue. One is paid by 44% of the population, that's the Swiss one, whereas Warren's would have been paid by less than 0.1% of the US. So these are simply not to be talked about in the same vein, and without specifying exactly what you're talking about, it's very hard to see how this discussion can advance significantly. And I know Liam has done really interesting polling work on what reactions are here in the UK, suggesting, for example, a high level of support for an annual wealth tax on individual net wealth over 10 million. So I think the experience tends to show a high level of support until you get into the weeds, and then the support dissipating rapidly if the threshold looks to be coming down anywhere near where people not just think they might be, but think their children might be, or think has any relevance to them at all. And this is a fundamental political challenge. And I look forward in the discussion, not least to hear from Liam and from others, as to how that fundamental challenge gets tackled. And just to conclude, one of the other interesting aspects of what Piketty was proposing, of course, was that this very high rate of wealth tax would itself fund the universal wealth endowment. A wealth tax on its own at a lowish rate of the sort that's being talked about makes no impact on wealth inequality for many years, unless it's accompanied by something like a universal endowment. So unless we're so confident of where policy will go, not only do we have to succeed in getting a wealth tax implemented, we have to be pretty confident it's going to last for 30 or 40 years before it starts to really have a dynamic impact on the wealth distribution, unless it's accompanied by other measures of the sort that are discussed in the book, including the universal endowment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Just wonderful, wonderful comments. Just, I suppose, three quick responses in a way. So there's an old tradition in Labour politics, at least, of revisionism. Every so often, politicians come along and actually take a proper look at the ideas with which they came into politics and say, well, look, what's changed? What do we need to revisit? And Barbara kind of really underlines why this is so important, because, you know, I was a new Labour minister. I used to bounce to work at Millbank in '96, singing "Things Can Only Get Better." And if you think about our political economy model back then, it was basically about trade, technology, and tax. So we basically thought that we could grow an economy faster with trade and technology, tax it a bit, and redistribute it. Simplistically, that was the model. And of course, we preserved a lot of the kind of market supremacism that we inherited. And actually, one of the things that we've learned now over the last 13 years is how that doesn't work in today's world, because today's markets are bedeviled by privilege, technopoly, and bubble. So we now know a lot more about rent seeking, where basically firms create rents and hold on to rents and basically extract wealth for them. We now know, because of the failures of competition policy, that you do get these superstar firms which now basically become technopolies. They control data, tech, R&D spending, as well as brand spending, in ways that basically mean that they're pretty close to monopolies, but they're, in some communities, very close to monopsony buyers of labour. But we also know, through the insights of behavioural economics, that that markets tend towards bubble. And of course, when they go bang, it's the poorest that lose most and the richest that recover fastest. So if you look at the way the wealth of the richest bounced back after both the financial crash and COVID, it was far, far faster than the livelihoods of most people. And so given that we now know these things about the way that markets go wrong, we've got to think, I think, a lot more anew about redistribution mechanisms. And the point that Barbara makes about allocative efficiency is something that isn't made very well in the book, but it does underpin the argument for why we need this notion of universal basic capital that encompasses not just housing wealth, not just pension wealth, but crucially your human capital too. Because if you think about what's coming with artificial intelligence and automation, here, Carl Frey, one of the great academics, I think Carl is still here, if you take Carl Frey's numbers and apply them to the British economy, you see that automation could wipe out more jobs in Britain than the shutdown of the coal industry and the steel industry put together. And so for many people, that is a devastating impact on their future economic prospects at a time when the richest are finding lots of great ways to preserve their wealth down the generations. So you've got a real need now to think methodically about building up human capital investments and giving people access to those pots in new ways in the future. And that would be fantastic for the allocative efficiency of the economy, especially this point about inventors, which is a fascinating point because the preceding book to this book is a book about entrepreneurs. So it's the history of British capitalism that I wrote about in 2016, told through the lives of 10 entrepreneurs. And the thing that's really striking about it is there aren't any rags to riches stories. I mean, there's one or two, maybe. So the only one I could find that really stood out was William Diamond Pitt, who was the sort of saviour of the East India Company and made his fortune basically trying to break the East India Company. But most people start off with wealth and then grow great wealth in the future. And that is telling you something about the need for human capital investment. But the point about how you fund that is what brings you to the points about tax. Because if we don't get a grip of this now, the problems that we've got today are about to multiply out of all recognition. And one of the people who influenced me a lot writing the book is Ben Ansell, who may be here, but is, I think, going to be. Ben, thank you. And Ben's work on looking at those places where wealth didn't keep pace, wealth growth didn't keep pace with national averages. What happens in those places? Well, it turns out that those are the places that tend to vote for Brexit, Le Pen, far right in Scandinavia, and Donald Trump. So if you like your politics unstable, well, yeah, we should just carry on like we're doing right now. If you would like politics that is a bit sort of calmer, then we need to think about some changes because nothing's forever, including the baby boomers. And as the baby boomers die, £5.5 trillion is about to cascade down the generations. Now, some people will inherit fortunes, but some people will inherit care bills. And so the wealth inequality that we've got today will be as nothing compared to what's going to happen to Gen Z. They're going to be the most unequal generation for 50 years if we don't change things. And so we're going to have to figure out how we begin taxing either wealth or income from wealth. And, when you look at it, we've got to get into the weeds quite quickly because that's the only way that you can figure out what's politically plausible and what isn't. Ben has done a lot of brilliant work on just trying to figure out exactly what it is that people will vote for. But here's the thing. If you put together ending the non-doms tax break or, I don't know, equalising tax on capital gains and income or charging national insurance contributions on investment income or putting a 2% tax on fortunes of over 10 million, that's about 30 to 40 billion pounds. A billion here, a billion there. Soon you're talking about real money. And that could help you build up things like a sovereign wealth fund, which growing at 8% a year could begin generating significant dividends for young people. So my point is that there are ways in which we can tackle wealth inequality today, but the faster we get into some of the details and figuring out where that overlapping consensus is, the faster we will make progress. But the warning is, if we don't, the political instability that we see today will be as of nothing compared to what is to come.
Thank you. So we're going to go to questions in a moment, but perhaps I could ask a question, and it's something you touch on in the book. But could you say a bit more about the scope for movement we have as one country, and whether we should be trying to form international alliances to move in this, just because
Yes.
wealth is quite mobile?
This is such an interesting point. So the OECD is now beginning to do some really hard work on wealth and wealth taxes. And Brian, you were making the point to me just before we came on about how we're going to be far more effective if we move globally, because that is the best way to stop tax leakage when it comes to wealth taxes. So funnily enough, I think there is now an opportunity to do that in a way that we've not even thought possible in the past. But the really striking thing is what the public thinks. And I think this could be one of those areas where the public is a long way ahead of politicians, and certainly Westminster. I was pretty taken aback by some of the polling numbers we saw around supports for different kinds of wealth taxes. We've got to get the framing right. We've got to get the proposals nice and specific. You've got to be able to talk about the losers as well as the winners. Crucially, people want to know what you're going to do with the money. But for the first time in my time in politics, I think there's a proposition there now that people will actually vote for.
Excellent. So just before we go to questions from the floor, can I remind you we are being streamed? Bear that in mind when you ask a question. Who would like to go first? So there is a woman over there, Clara.
Thank you.
And if you could wait for the microphone to arrive.
Thank you. Really interesting talk, so thank you very much, Liam. How sure are you that all of these sort of interesting policies that could work, and there seems to be public perception that this is something that the public would support, how convinced are you that if we were to have a general election that Labour would, someone was going to ask it, that Labour would be able to support this and take it into some of their policies?
Yeah. It's the first question. Yeah. Do you want to do one by one?
Yeah, go on.
So I had to think about, when we launched this a couple of weeks ago, I had to think sort of quite carefully about the public presentation. And seriously, I genuinely think that this is a 3-term project. I don't think these changes are the kinds of things that you would see on a pledge card. And some of the ideas, as we've heard, are going to take quite a lot of work. I guess what I learned from being a minister in the last Labour government is that when you've got your political capital, you need to use it. And right now, for understandable reasons, Labour has got this kind of dilemma between the majority and the mandate. And it's worried that it's got to be really cautious and guard against the politics of loss aversion in order to maximise the majority. And the risk is, of course, that impacts the mandate that you get on the other side. So my hope in writing the book now is to say, look, there's a load of plausible ideas out there. Let's find a way as a country of talking about these, working out what we agree with, so that on day one of a different government, we could actually begin getting to work on the detailed design phases, the detailed design work for a 2nd and 3rd term manifesto. And that took me into some work that I did looking at manifestos since 1945. And if you look at the big change manifestos, 45, say 64, 97, 79, each of them only uses the word radical once. The manifestos that get really bold and radical are often the manifestos that come 2nd, 3rd, and later. But you're not going to get to those manifestos if you don't do the donkey work of figuring out how to make this stuff work, like, immediately. So that is the way I'm going to have my cake and eat it, I suppose. But that's equally why this conversation is so important and so interesting. This room is packed, right? But every room that we've done on the book has been packed. And that's not because of me. It's because people know that there's an issue here that we need to get our heads around as a country. So building this debate now, creating that atmosphere for change is, I guess, my best hope for actually moving the dial on this stuff in the future. The ideas are there. The anxiety levels are still high about when and how to put it to an election test. And that's why we've got to use the first term of the next government in such a forensic way and in such a quick and rapid way.
So I think that question was largely for Liam. Is there anything you guys want to say on that? Question from Ben Ansell. Lady there and then over here.
Yeah, long time political economist and government senior civil servant. So I have two very brief points. My first related to what you've just talked about. Liam and Brian, you also mentioned it in your points, the ability to have a more sophisticated dialogue around trade-offs and paradoxes and how we can act as a collective, a social collective or a political collective and be prepared to make individual sacrifices and how actually to be able to debate these issues. I think you alluded to it there in your response, Liam, but if that doesn't precede a very conceptual argument about policy ideas, then my experience tells me that we'll move very slowly or we won't move in a way that you probably define as radical. And my second point relates to planetary boundaries, consumption, and many, I won't make a point on there, I'll just say that those words were noticeably absent from, you talked about growth rather than redistribution, and you're nodding, I don't need to say more, but just to raise those words in this room. Thank you.
Yeah. So that is definitely the next book, because you're right, that is a significant gap. But on the first point, you give me permission to talk about one of my kind of pet peeves in politics, right? Which is that everybody in great sort of political commentators say things like, it's really important for a political party to own the future. And everyone nods at that as if it's a great bit of political wisdom. And everyone in Westminster, they kind of wander around saying, we've got to own the future. And they never kind of tell you what's in the fucking future. And so what we've got to kind of just do a better job of is just kind of saying, look, there's a couple of scenarios by which the future is going to unfold. It can either look like this, insert description, or it can look like this. This is a bad thing. This is a good thing. We're at a fork in the road. Let's take some steps that take us down the good path and not the bad path. And actually, Tony Blair was brilliant at narrating exactly what those kind of future courses of action might look like. And it's a bit of a lost art of politics at the moment. And I suppose that's why the book is, the darkness in the book is the warning, which is that unless we change course now, any serious measure of equality this century is about to become impossible. Impossible. If you've got £5.5 trillion cascading down the generations and almost all of it goes to some very rich people, inequality is not going to get fixed this century. So, this really is kind of last chance saloon. And the perils of that should scare us all. Because the perils of that is a politics that is vicious and violent and febrile and not really a kind of country we want to live in. So, time to get a grip, people. Time to get a grip.
Barbara and Brian, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, the mention again of the wealth cascading down the generations does point you towards either, you could see it as an alternative or a complementary strategy, which is to fix inheritance tax or fix capital transfers tax, which currently has a very strange structure and scares a lot of people. And yet has a lot of people passing on very substantial wealth without paying very much. And what really brings taxes in general, but wealth taxes in particular, into disrepute is the notion that only mugs pay them.
Yeah.
And that played a very substantial part in the ability of those who were advocating for the abolition of wealth taxes in a number of other European countries that were sort of still surprised that they did away with wealth taxes, countries that we think care a lot about equality. But the notion that they could be avoided was deeply undermining. And I think there are very obvious, maybe hard to sell, but technically obvious ways to improve the structure of inheritance and capital transfers tax here. That don't even involve the shift that Tony Atkinson would have been recommending towards a capital acquisition or a capital receipt, so that you get taxed on how much you receive rather than how much is left by your parent. You as an individual get taxed on your accumulated receipts of transfers from your parents or other relatives, without even going to that structural change, there are relatively straightforward ways of improving the capacity to tax this cascade.
If I can just add something about taxation, I mean, in an increasingly globalized world, the growing challenge is that taxing capital is a lot more mobile than labor, always. And then with a sort of more globalized world, then of course taxing capital means that capital has a higher incentive to flow away. So there's no way to solve this problem without international cooperation on taxation, and I think we're very far behind on this kind of cooperation. And this problem is a lot more severe now than it used to be because of globalization.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point. So if you look at foreign direct investment into Britain, say, so FDI into Britain has grown this century. It's growing 5 times faster from offshore accounts and countries classed as dictatorships or only partially free countries. And this is quite interesting, I think, because it tells you that money is flowing into Britain because Britain is seen in some circumstances as a safe harbour. Rule of law, nice schools, half-decent universities, and so in that kind of global investment market, I agree with you about the way wealth taxes can affect returns, which the design, therefore, is important. But equally, I think that we shouldn't be too afraid of that capital mobility because there are a load of other reasons that people are investing in Britain as well. They're not simply looking at the financial return, I suppose. And that is not to take away anything from the point about international cooperation, which I 100% agree with. And I'm pinning a lot of hope on the OECD, but that could actually be progress, I think.
Thank you. Ben Ansell.
And thank you for the unnecessarily kind words about my work earlier. So let me be the bearer of bad news again. And I'm glad that Brian spoke about inheritance tax because you'll know, and we've spoken about before, I think there's a very low level of liking for the inheritance tax in this country. It's when I polled and asked people to say how fair they thought 9 different taxes were in the UK, inheritance tax is right at the bottom. And what's at the top, funnily, is income tax, and then, NI, and then income tax. Which means that people, the man behind the tree is not, I think, the only way of thinking about tax. People seem to think it's fair that the tax that they pay the most of, and national insurance is pretty regressive, in part regressive, right, because you don't pay much of it at high incomes. They still support those taxes. What they really don't like, at least in my data, is taxes on inheritance, taxes on savings interest, and, well, everybody hates it, stamp duty.
Yeah.
And so those 3 are very, very unpopular. Which then brings me to the 2 words I thought would be worth mentioning, council tax. So council tax is actually of moderate hatred in the mix here. And, if we were in the US or in Canada, people would be taxed at a percentage of the assessed value of their property. And here, there is a monotonic relationship between your property price and how much you pay, but it's pretty shallow, right? So you can live in the £3 million mansion and pay £3,000 a year, and be paying, 1,500 grand a year in a £150,000 house. Now I know nobody wants to touch the values that God set down in 1991 for land value, but it seems to me that that's another conversation we should have. It's difficult because people can't easily convert the value of their property into a stream of taxes, I understand that, but they're able to do so in the US and Canada and other places. And I'm wondering, rather than hit inheritance or hit these transfers that people hate for a whole variety of reasons, whether just standard property taxation might be another way of looking at things.
Yeah. So people here will remember the controversy around whether King Charles would pay inheritance tax on the legacy from the late Queen, and of course he would have been the exception if he did, because of course once you begin inheriting that kind of money, as Brian says, I mean the incidence of the tax just kind of collapses. So inheritance tax, I think, is difficult. It could be that a gift tax, like a lot of other OECD countries, is a different way to approach it. But I mean, from memory, I think yours is amongst the only polling around on detailed tax proposals. Is that? Did you come across?
You guys have done it before.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the same people who remember the question.
But this is the point, really. And unless we get into the detailed design of what, I mean, maybe there are sort of 10 to 15 different alternatives on wealth taxes, what we would call wealth taxes. But the amount of polling on them is pretty limited. Yet, what really struck us on New Party Group when we were doing this little book last year is the level of support between left and right on things like a wealth tax. And you found this, I think, on a wealth tax of 1% or 2% on over 10 million. So there's definitely a political market for some of this here, but, you know, as the French finance minister once famously said, I mean, the art of taxation is plucking the goose while minimising the hissing. And so that's what political polling is for, right? You know, to figure out how to minimise the hissing. But we've got to get into it now because we have to.
Chris Dye.
On the nature of good things and bad things, I wonder what people really care about. The focus of this discussion has been about inequality. But in your interactions with many people that you've described them, do people care about inequality, or do the people at the bottom care more about having a decent basic income, not going to a food bank, having their kids go to basic schools? They don't want to own super yachts for the most part, and maybe they don't care if other people do. So the question is, do people care about inequality, or do they care about having a decent basic income?
Yeah, so this is in a way why I ended where I did, because there has been a failure, certainly on the left, to talk about freedom for a long time. So we you know, since John Rawls, we've ended up talking about justice a lot and talking about freedom not very much. And there's a lost tradition of freedom on the left that goes back to the Levellers. But if you want to couch your arguments in terms of freedoms, plural, not just sort of freedom from the tyranny of poverty, not just freedom from your anxieties, but if you want to talk about the new freedoms that are possible, that is a more persuasive way of talking about how you want to change people's lives. You know, the right to nature, the right to work, the right to a decent home, the right to food, the right to an education, not just for a bit, but through your life, the right to a rich cultural life. These are freedoms which are impossible for many of my constituents and which are impoverished for many of my constituents compared to people who live in Solihull or Sutton Coldfield, maybe 8 miles up the road. And so I think a lot of the political argument for this may well be best couched in terms of the freedoms that you enjoy and, crucially, the security of those freedoms. How confident are you in your own agency, options, and control? But this is a novel argument for people on the left because it's not been made since, you know, Roy Hattersley's book on Choose Freedom in the early 1980s. So there is a concern about inequality that is rising, but the salience of it is still quite low compared to lots of other hot topics in British politics. And that's why I think we have to talk about it in a more positive way, which is what are the advantages that I can give you? And if I think about the great progress of the years ahead, how do we share the future? How do we fairly share that future so that actually freedoms and security are not just the preserve of some, but they're the birthright of all? So I think you make a really important political point about this.
So what I'm going to do now is take 3 questions and then ask the 3 speakers to pick one to respond to. We're running out of time, so if you could make your questions as short as possible. There's one there and then one over there. So very brief if you can.
Yeah, but you're just following on from this. I mean, how is money going to be passed on to the poorest people? I mean, what is the practical method of doing that?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. And then one over here. And then another hand up. And
Thanks. I direct a global research study on family offices over at the business school. How at risk are these proposals and your optimism by an increasing willingness of family offices to say that their capital is going to be used for impact and for social good? This capital is, of course, private and not covered by regulation and with no accountability.
thank you. And then, Clara, you had one there.
Hi, thanks. Every time one hears talk about solving inequality, there's always talk about growing the economy. And there is an inherent contradiction between growing the economy and not breaching 1.5 degrees. How do you solve inequality? I mean, we're locked into quite a nasty neoliberal capitalist system, which now seems to be in everyone's blood. And the trouble is that everybody wants more. So how do you organize greater redistribution without the growth to take care of the climate?
Thank you. Thanks for those admirably concise questions. I'm going to go to Brian, then Barbara, then Liam. And don't feel the need to answer all of them, just pick out one.
Question about how you direct income to where. Thank you. Question about how do you direct income to where it's most needed. To give a simple-minded answer, you reverse the cuts to the social protection system that have been implemented here over the last many years, which has left the system much less well able to cope than it used to be, or than systems elsewhere currently are. So you can think about structures as well, but that's a longer story. But the resourcing of the social transfer system is absolutely critical, and has been going in the wrong direction for many years. And to the point about family offices, it's unfair to recommend another book while talking about one book. But the other book I was reading while reading Liam's is a fascinating 800-year history of the rich by an economic historian named Guido Alfani, nicely titled As Gods Among Men, A History of the Rich in the West, going back to the Black Death. And his point about the current situation is that he sees the rich as potentially losing the normative basis for the acceptance of their riches if they don't pay their taxes. And obviously some rich people see the world that way and others don't. I don't think generally that philanthropy is seen as an alternative for the reasons that you advance. So I think philanthropy plus paying your taxes is the way that the moral underpinnings of wealth can be rescued.
Barbara.
Thank you. I will start from your question about how do we make sure that everybody has enough. And then, can you hear me? Okay. And then, of course, I mean, redistribution and the welfare state are really important pillars of that. But also, I mean, fighting the causes of why we got there is really about creating good jobs. Creating good jobs means like embracing new technologies, embracing globalization in a way that creates good jobs. And also it means like embracing like green technologies to make the things sustainable. And this is also speaking to the second question we had from the audience. So in a sense, if one thinks about redistribution and welfare system, then of course this can correct some of the consequences of inequality, but we also have to think about the causes.
Yeah. So I should say up front that the ideas here are not a substitute for a basic social security system, well-funded public services, and they've got to come on top. And that does kind of draw your eye to some of the fiscal challenges we've got. So some of the best work that has been done on just bringing up universal credit to like an amount you could actually live on is done by the Trussell Trust and Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Their work on the Essentials Guarantee shows that you would need about 22 billion a year just to bring universal credit back up to a level of basic civility. These are sort of quite big numbers. Equally, if you think about public services, universal childcare or fixing our social care system, these are absolutely essential for equality, meaningful equality in the 21st century. They will also be expensive too. But I guess my point is that those two things for me are not enough if you have still got these problems of wealth inequality becoming more and more serious. because I now see more clearly the relationship between wealth inequality and inequality of power. That's the thing that troubles me most. And, you know, just to kind of underline this point, I sit on the liaison committee, and we get to ask difficult questions to the Prime Minister for 6 minutes once a quarter. That's how our parliamentary democracy works. And so I asked him about his tax bill. And I said, so, you know, you pay 23% tax, you know, at a time when 1 in 5 people are paying sort of 40% tax. And his answer was, well, you know, it wasn't, you know, this is fair, this is reasonable. It was, well, this was the system that Gordon Brown introduced. You know, that was the basic line. That was the basic line of argument. And I kind of think, well, if that is your strongest line of argument, then even you know, Prime Minister, that our system is out of date. So there is not going to be any progress on any of this unless there is progress on the tax system, which is why the conversation about tax is so fundamental. A bit like Brian, I don't think that the philanthropists will kind of get away with it. I think they may be more influential in the US than here. Maybe I will be proved wrong about this. But the one thing that I did want to flag from your remarks was that the way in which family offices are now protecting wealth down the generations is changing the way that wealth dynamics have traditionally worked in our economy. So traditionally, lots of societies have this quote of sandals to the stars, back to the sandals in 3 generations, or variations thereof. That's not true anymore, because once a family has got wealth, it's going to hire wealth managers that preserve that wealth for generations to come. And at a time when other people may be losing their jobs through AI, it's one of those forces that are going to drive inequality harder and harder if we don't fix things today. And I suppose this point on growth and preserving our planet is a fair one that could do with a follow-up volume, absolutely. But I suppose I would share the analysis that you've got to create a better supply of better funded jobs. Many of those jobs will be more knowledge-intensive jobs. But equally, there is a case to be made for actually looking at the carbon footprint of the super rich. So those super yachts, those luxury mansions, those private jets, the carbon footprints associated with those are unbelievable. And one of the big topics, the editor told me it was just too big to put in the book, but one of the big topics that I would have loved to have gone into more is about the future of carbon taxes. Because ultimately, we're not going to fix the tax system without taxing carpetbaggers, capital, and carbon. And the place to start, surely, must be fair taxes on the carbon footprint of the super rich, who generate so much of the carbon that is killing our planet.
Well, carpetbaggers, carbon, and what was the third one?
Capital.
Capital is a good way to finish up. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Just before I thank the speakers, we have another talk this week. Patrick Vallance talking about science advice to government. I think it's actually full up, but do join us online if you're not coming along. And then in early March, we have a talk from another Birmingham MP from across the aisle, Andrew Mitchell. But will you join me in thanking, first of all, our two discussants, Brian Nolan and Barbara Petrongolo, and our main speaker, Liam Byrne, for a very fascinating talk. And before you clap, then just to remind you that next door, you will be able to have a glass of wine and to be able to purchase Brian's, Liam's book and possibly get a signature. So thank you all three for a really fascinating evening.